Welcome to Deadline. Exciting, vibrant, intelligent discussion where politics and media meet. I'm Kerry Campbell. On our show today, American health care. Will the Supreme Court strike down Affordable Health Cares Act? We'll also discuss the Arab awakening. Or is it the Arab uprising? Then we'll talk about Occupy Wall Street, awake from a relative winter slumber. And America's media hot topic, Trayvon Martin, his death, the debate. Does it take us to hypocrisy or justice? Our guest on the show today, Dr. Brad Blanton. Dr. Brad Blanton is an author, an independent Green Party leader. Welcome, Dr. Brad Blanton.
Thanks.
Adam Kokesh. Adam Kokesh is a producer and a U.S. Marine Corps veteran. Welcome, Adam Kokesh.
Thank you.
Hussein Ibish. Hussein Ibish of the American Task Force on Palestine. Welcome, Hussein.
Oh, thank you.
And Bruce Dixon joins us by phone. Bruce Dixon is a journalist from the Black Agenda. Welcome, Bruce Dixon, and welcome all. All right, our first item of discussion, and Bruce, we're going to come to you on the phone for this. The latest opinion polls show Americans support the Affordable Health Care Act's provisions when those rules are explained. But is the fix in at the U.S. Supreme Court? Is this Bush versus Gore all over again? What are your thoughts, Mr. Dixon?
I'm not sure I agree with that. When the Barack Obama's 2009 health care bill is actually explained to people, they don't like most of the features of it. They don't like the fact that it keeps them bound hand and foot to, they don't like the individual mandate. They wanted a public option or single payer. And what they got is a situation that leaves corporations firmly in control of who gets care and with no cost limits on it. So I'm not sure I agree with you.
Dr. Brad, thank you.
This.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. Dr. Brad Blanton is nodding his head in agreement, apparently, with you. Dr. Blanton.
Yeah, it's one of those things that even when you win, you lose. As long as the corporations stay in power, the insurance companies are in power, the people with the money are in power, they remained in control. It wasn't much of a health care bill in the first place. And now the Republicans are raising hell about it being too much. It wasn't even the beginning of enough. And I would say that everybody, almost everyone I know, thinks it's a dinky little bill. It didn't have anything to do with actually changing things so that people got taken care of in America, except for a few minor things about not being able to have pre-existing conditions, which was a big lie in the first place.
Well, honestly, I don't think that's minor. I certainly agree that this is not sufficient. I don't think it's the end. I think it's the beginning. And it's going to take a lot more work to remove the excessive amount of profit from the healthcare system. But I do think this was a significant step in the right direction, and I would be surprised if the Supreme Court struck it down. And if they do, in whole or in part, that'll be a very bad thing, because I do think most Americans actually did benefit, even if it was in an insufficient way, from the law.
Well, it's ironic to hear supporters of Obamacare talk about the ills of the current system as having too much power in the hands of the few and the insurance companies, when the insurance companies wrote a lot of the legislation. And some will acknowledge that, but a lot will say, no, this is a purely well-intentioned piece of legislation, and that's all it is. And that's obviously not the case. So personally, I would hope that the Supreme Court will strike it down. I don't believe that I'm not going to make any particular predictions as to the inner workings of the Supreme Court. But if you look at what this is admitting, what's so sad about this, when people want to return power to the hands of the people, when they want the consumer to be empowered, they want ultimately everybody who's going about this with best intentions is saying, how do we empower the consumer? How do we best serve patients, essentially? And every nationalized system is taking that connection away from the service providers.
Understood. Let me ask you a simple question. Do you think it would be helpful to allow insurance companies and other healthcare providers to go back to being able to discriminate against sick people and deny them coverage?
Well, no, we have a problem today where we have this intermediate ground between single payer and and a true free market healthcare system where communities are able to get together and lower the price of healthcare and improve the delivery system so that we can take care of everybody, as I think we would in an environment where there's less government intervention, where you're able to have voluntary community-type collectives instead of forced collectives.
But please don't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the better. This is better.
Well, Mr. Dixon wants to jump in.
You have more faith in government than I do.
I do think it's better.
Quite frankly, the federal government has granted waivers that allow insurance companies to discriminate against people on the bases of pre-existing conditions and on other bases. They've been quite fast and loose about granting these waivers. So the notion that the Obama bill prohibits insurance companies from discriminating against people is just plain nonsense.
Well, it certainly makes it more difficult. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt it makes it more difficult.
It makes it slightly more difficult, but all in all, what does it mean? We're arguing, as usual, is the way the two-party system works is that people argue about nitpicky little things that don't really mean much in terms of actual change in healthcare presentation. There is no change in power because of what the Democrats have done. There's no change in power. The power still resides with corporations, and it stays
and we should
that
also
way.
note, and we should also note that the Obama plan is the Romney plan, the Romney Massachusetts plan. So
that's true.
Tell us about the differences between these two parties.
Dr. Blanton, your party, the Greens, advocates what?
Well, I ran as an independent Green against Eric Cantor. And what I advocated was anything other than Cantor. I walked across Virginia to raise a little bit of money, and I called it the Walk Across Virginia to Cure Cantor. And I think that I got 25% of the vote, which is a record for an independent, any independent in Virginia, and as an independent Green. But the thing is, it's like, it seems absolutely futile to tinker around with even talking about differences between the Democratic and Republican Party. That's the way they win all the time. They act as though they have differences. And the big fuss between and amongst the Republicans and then between Republicans and Democrats is considered to be the big debate. But it's a really minuscule little debate in which hardly any intelligence is brought to bear. No background information is really brought to bear, and no real information is shared. They're still basically coming from a moralist position, a moralistically correct position versus another moralistic correction. The whole problem in the world is that fundamentalists the world over, arguing with each other, are in control.
No, I don't think that's wrong, except that it's an observation that carries weight if you step outside the structures that exist in terms of power in this country. Now, you can take a revolutionary approach and say we need to make some extremely radical changes, and it's fine, and work towards that. In the moment, in the existing moment, you can call differences between Republicans and Democrats or between having the Obama bill or not having it because it's struck down by the Supreme Court as minuscule, or you can look at what those minuscule differences are and appreciate them or not. And I personally, I'll come back to it, I think we're better off with that health care bill than we were without it. And it's not sufficient, but there are differences. Now, I think there often is a sort of choice to be made whether you want to stand outside the system and kind of pox on all its houses. That's fine to do, both practically and rhetorically. But there's space also for people to get into the weeds of what actually is happening and do the tinkering that other people can dismiss as irrelevant. And I think that can be useful. Honestly, I really do.
Mr. Dixon.
Yeah, what my friend here is talking about is tinkering is kind of, well, let's talk about the actual guts of this bill here for a second. The only few good things, like allowing minors under the age of 26 to be covered on their insurance policies, all the good things in this bill could have been done without the individual mandate that forces people to buy health insurance from private companies. So we need to separate the good things in this bill from the individual mandate, which is why it's in front of the Supreme Court. And a real telltale on the fact that the Obama administration knew that this bill was junk from the start comes up when you compare it to the 1965-66 Medicare Act. When Lyndon Baines Johnson pushed that through, they were mailing out the Medicare cards in 10 or 11 months. It went into effect immediately because people would know it's a good thing and they'd reelect him. Obama's bill doesn't begin to cover people until 2014, after another presidential election cycle. If it was that great, he'd have made it effective immediately. Come on, let's be real.
Well, we also want to talk about how the media is covering this. Adam, you're up. The one question there, was the political will at the time that this bill was passed, was the political will there to do what Mr. Dixon is describing?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't have audio for Mr. Dixon, but I did want to go back and comment on this idea of people waking up to the reality of the two-party system, because it's really hard to deny it. And I mean, this I'll make the connection here, but it's really hard to deny at this point the collaboration between the Republican and Democratic parties, the sources of funding that they share, the special interests that they both love to buy to pay off with legislation. You know, that they're bought off by the same members of the superclass, the same corporate powers, the same banksters, the same people that control and pull the strings for both parties. But what's happening now is that when people are waking up to this, especially with the younger generation that's more plugged into the internet, what they're realizing isn't that, hey, this system needs to be improved, but that there's something fundamentally wrong with it. And when they look at the problems facing the world today, they're able to trace so many of them back to the very concept of government, and they're realizing that what all government is a monopoly on force and violence, and that turning to that, it has become an institution of all of the worst elements of human nature: our desire to control others, our desire to dominate others, our desires to abuse others, our desires to abdicate responsibility for our own lives and pass that off to other people. And we do it through the violence of government, through violent, forceful redistribution of wealth. We do it through things like Obamacare, which says if you're going to be living and breathing in America, you're going to pay for your health care services this way or that way. We're going to regulate it, as opposed to allowing you to make a free decision as a free human being. And so when people are waking up to this today, they're going a whole step deeper. And what I hear is happening in the way that people are waking up when they're getting, and we like to use the metaphor pulled out of the Matrix. Yeah. You know, and I'm sure you like to use that too when you talk about getting unplugged from the two-party system. But when they're unplugging now on the internet, what's happening is they're going through like a mind melt process like has never been possible in human history before. When before, like, you might come across one piece of information and be like, well, I'm giving up on the voting system, or I'm giving up on the two-party system, or whatever it is. But now people are able to indulge every single curiosity online. What they're coming to is the conclusion that we don't need government to solve problems, that we should be solving peacefully.
Let me make a very quick point about that. I think that sentiment has become much more widespread on both the left and the right.
Yes.
However, when you ask people if they use government services, they say no. And then you start asking them if they have Medicaid, if they have college tuition loan guarantees, if they have all these. In fact, they do. And in fact, I don't share your point of view about your cynical point of view about government. I think government is ultimately a tool that can be used positively or negatively.
I have a cynical view of government because I have a positive view of humanity.
Fine, but I mean, but government is a collective expression of humanity. You can have better or worse systems. You can have a cleaner
gross expression. Well, I think humanity is better than our governments.
Well, indeed, humanity is better than governments. But I've lived in situations where there is no government. I grew up in a part of West Beirut where there was no government at all. And each street block was run by a different gang with kids and teenagers with guns, and there was no authority and no recourse and no protection. And I can tell you that is not an optimal arrangement either.
Well, that was an environment created by
Let me jump in there and pick up on...
Actually, it wasn't. It was created by the collapse of a government.
Let me pick
exactly.
up... But let me pick
as opposed to the peaceful transition and deliberate rejection of violence as a way of organizing society.
Yes, that didn't happen.
Which is what we're advocating.
Good luck.
Which is something different. But see, you're making a step backwards. You're saying that some improvement is better than no improvement. Well, if it's an improvement that increases the size of government, you're basically saying that more aspects of society will be governed by arbitrary force rather than peaceful voluntary exchange.
This is if you dismiss the possibility of having an actually well-functioning representative system. And I don't dismiss that.
So it's representative and you can have 51% of people vote away the rights of the...
Well, no, absolutely. Of course not. Of course not.
The purpose of government,
He's saying if we
go
can come
back
down
to-
from the philosophical discussion about government, go ahead. Go ahead.
Go back to the healthcare quandary. Right now,
go back to the specific healthcare quandary.
The fact is that the Obama bill is not going, is only going to cut the number of uninsured people in this country in half. It's only going to cut the number of uninsured people in this country in half. The political will.
He says the Obama bill is only going to cut the uninsured in half.
Single payer. The political will on the street was to cover everybody in, and do it a civilized way. The political will among those who were taking money from the insurance companies, and that's both houses of Congress, that's our judiciary, and that's our executive branch, was to give the corporations what they wanted. And in the end, the corporations got what they wanted. And cost.
But to talk about political will,
Hold on, just a second. When you say but really, when you say only half the uninsured people will now be insured, that's saying the glass is still half empty.
That's according to their
right.
Right.
What I'm trying to tell you is that can be rephrased with the same degree of accuracy, saying half of the uninsured people will now be insured. In other words, it is certainly an improvement for those
everybody, sir.
Well, of course, I would have liked
to. Single payer was desirable. Canada has single payer. Civilized places have single payer.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And
let me take that analogy, though. Here's a glass.
Let's talk about the fact that more than half the bankruptcies, actually more than two-thirds of the bankruptcies,
you don't have to convince me of this,
involve medical costs.
Right. You're preaching to the computer.
You have nothing.
You're preaching to the converted.
But look, the argument about whether the glass is half full or half empty is irrelevant. There's a glass with some liquid in it. That's what you got to get. So the glass of the United States has this many people who are uninsured with regard to health care.
And that's got to be fixed.
And that's got to be fixed.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, gentlemen, we need to move on to the discussion of Trayvon Martin and the tragic death of this young man. Mr. Dixon, in Chicago, if you could, please, what is your perspective on these events?
Actually, I'm in Atlanta.
Atlanta, sorry.
As a black man who, in his younger days, used to get stopped constantly by the police behind the wheel and walking for nothing all the time, there's a great deal of public outrage, not just about the Trayvon Martin murder, but outrage because the kind of things that happened to him and unjustified police violence and hyper-surveillance of black people, especially black males, is endemic. It is the practice of law enforcement agencies around this country, the universal practice. So it's not surprising that when this vigilante killed Mr. Martin, that the cops just let him go because he was felt to be one of them. However, what we're seeing on the part of most black leadership here, what's basically going to happen here is that Trayvon Martin's death is going to become a get-out-the-vote thing for Democrats. That's what it's going to become because the black leadership class are not about trying to do any lasting rollback of the American police state, of the American prison state. We've got 2.5 million people in prison right now in this country, and they're not advancing plans that are going to roll that back. They're not even trying to lead advocacy of how we can roll back the number of people in prison, how we can stop the hyper-surveillance and the hyper-policing of black males. They're only trying to use it as a symbol to do their fundraising and to get votes out, and that's the ugliest thing about this.
I think so too. The thing is that there are people, particularly younger people, who are used to getting information for themselves now, a little more than they used to be, are actually authentically interested in what actually is so. They're interested in authenticity. And the thing is that leadership is always behind, or at least leadership that's paid for by money, is always behind what's actually the little nitpicking argument that's a smaller argument to avoid talking about that we need a thoroughgoing social change. There is no justice in the system that we have. There is no justice in this system. It's that whatever passes for justice is a BS, and we all know it. And we are not going to reform the educational system, the justice system, or anything that has to do with the financial system or any of these systems. Reforming them is completely futile. Replacing them is what's necessary, and that's why we're marching tomorrow. When we march to the EPA, there will be several thousand of us. We're going to occupy Washington, D.C. again. I hope to get arrested again, and I hope that I get to talk to the newspapers again. And we just keep working in a futile system to talk about something that deeply needs to be done, which is to replace, not reform the system.
Well, the Martin case is shocking. It is shocking to the conscience of the whole country. I don't doubt that the Justice Department is going to have the final word on this. Clearly, the local authorities are absolutely incapable.
Has the media covered him fairly?
I think finally it did. I think for a long time it ignored it, but I think pressure from the family and pressure from the community has brought requisite attention to what is known about what happened, to the point that the feds, I think, are going to do something about it. Now, on the bigger question of the incredible sort of, and here I agree with everything that's been said so far, the unbelievable dysfunctionality of what passes for a justice system in this country, criminal justice system in particular, it needs to be addressed urgently, and particularly this gigantic prison population, this prison industry that we have, which is another for-profit industry. And there's a very clear path to a first step to address it, which is decriminalization of drug possession and use. And that would eliminate a huge majority of people who are in prison now for offenses that do not harm other people and that should not, in fact, be punishable crimes, but certainly not punishable by imprisonment. But you've got just a vast number of people in this country in prison for doing harmless things like possessing and smoking marijuana or some other drugs that do not harm any other person. They may harm the individual or not, but I mean that it seems to me is the most obvious first step in that direction.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Dixon makes a really interesting point, and that what's more interesting than the case itself, because I think at this point we see that it is an indicator of much larger problems, but really in and of itself kind of limited in its significance. And it's interesting to see how it's being twisted and how it's being diverted and who's using it and manipulating it for what. And it's almost impossible to say anything about the case in any way without being seen as taking a side or being critical or being racially insensitive at this point. And I think the media did a lot of that, but with a lot of premature reporting, and I think kind of flamed all of that and made it more possible for this to be shown. But what we've seen, like with the rallies for Trayvon Martin, is that there is a larger problem with racism in America still. And what really sickens me to see is how, as Mr. Dixon pointed out, this is something that's going to be used by the Democratic Party. This is going to be something that's used by Obama. You know, just like Obamacare. Either way, if they lose on Obamacare or they win on Obamacare, it's a rallying cry going into November. And same thing with Trayvon Martin, because Obama said, and this was really shameful. I'm sorry, just one last thing. Really shameful for Obama to come out and say, that's what my son would have looked like.
Why?
Because what that's saying is that you should identify with people by their race, and what that does is further the divide. Instead of saying,
I got to come in there now. Wait a minute. I may be the only African American here, and for a white person to say it's a problem when black people identify by race, that's hypocritical. That's monstrously hypocritical. My ancestors didn't choose to come over here; they were brought over here by white people. I grew up in a section of Chicago where only blacks lived because white people did that to us. The black person in America is a creation of white people. So for a white person to say that it's a tragedy anytime black people identify as black is monstrously hypocritical.
No, I'm not saying that. Hold on. I appreciate that.
Absolutely wrong, and I utterly reject it, and that's just that way.
No, I appreciate the point. I appreciate the point in the bigger picture. Absolutely.
I have a different objection.
I wouldn't have a problem with Democrats using this if they were actually going to do anything about changing the system. I wouldn't have any problem with them using it. But in fact, the Democrats helped construct this prison system, helped construct this prison state, and all they are interested in is living off the fumes of the movement. The so-called civil rights leadership in this country, they didn't get Troy Davis off, and Troy Davis was obviously innocent.
Now,
The NAACP hasn't got a condemned person off death row who was innocent since the days of the 1940s and late 30s when Thurgood Marshall used to crisscross the South, barnstorming as a lawyer, defending black people on death row. He got many of them off that way.
No, hey, I'm with you. Look, let me
what
just...
we have is a situation here where there ought to be a movement, but instead of there being a lasting movement, instead of there being dramatic gestures that lead to and fuel a movement, all of this is being funneled into the fundraising and get out the vote arm of the Democratic Party, which in the end doesn't want to do anything.
Exactly. Now, hold on. I'm not saying the statement was wrong. I'm not saying that the racial identification was wrong, that it was a morally incorrect statement for Obama to make. I'm not making that case. I'm just saying that it was politically motivated. That the reason for the way that he said it that way was for political reasons, like everything Obama does, like exactly what you just pointed out.
Honestly,
so I'm not saying that the racism's not an issue. I'm not trying to deny any of that, and I'm not trying to criticize black culture
I
even.
will challenge
But
that.
I do think that Obama says most of what he says for reasons of political manipulation for exactly the reasons that you stated.
President Obama is a politician, and most of what he says is said for political calculation. In this case, I think you may be looking at an exception. This, I think you may be.
Come on.
This is no. Listen, it is very important, I think, for the President of the United States to make a point like that to the general public. I really think it's very healthy for the President of the United States to make that identification from the White House.
It's hard to make the case that this is his true heart when you have more African Americans in jail today than there were slaves in America.
Look, I mean, if you want to lay that at the feet of this president alone and his personality, this man is not the king.
Not his personality.
This man is not the king. This is the CEO of the United States. There's not that much discretionary power for the President of the United States.
The CEO of the United States is saying things that he doesn't believe just to please this or that giant corporation, or just to or just to please this and that powerful interest.
Yeah.
And if that's true, then how do we know he's telling us the truth now?
Well, you don't, and you have to make that. You have to make that judgment for yourself. You have to make that judgment for yourself, and I'm the one person on this show who's saying I believe him.
Okay.
Call me naive, call me stupid, call me a sucker, call me what you want, but I actually think,
when it comes to Obama.
Fine. I think that every individual, whether they're a politician or not, at a certain point, they have their gut reactions, and I find it plausible that an African-American politician would look at the Trayvon Martin case and say, wait a minute, that could have been my son, goddammit. And I won't dismiss that as simple propaganda.
Before he opens his mouth, it goes through a little calculus, and he says, does my gut instinct serve me politically? All right, I'll say it.
For a lot of black politicians.
Well, the problem is we know that we can't trust him.
Firing off a drive-by and that sort of thing is par for the course. If you can't do that in front of an audience every now and then you can't.
It's all right what he said, but the problem is how it's being used. And it's just the same problem that we have. There's an endemic problem. I have a book that was a nationwide bestseller called Radical Honesty, based on me being a psychotherapist in Washington, D.C. for 35 years. And basically, the fundamental place to study lying in the world is Washington, D.C. It's the best place you could possibly find to study it. And so I became an expert in lying.
They pay you to lie here.
And what happens is that one of the reasons we've got a system that sucks like it does is because we've all been taught that who we are is our identity. We're the grades we make, we're our reputation, and what we're supposed to do with our life energy is to lie to maintain our image in the eyes of other people. So that we're all politicians.
Yeah.
And we all know that we can't trust each other unless we make some kind of a commitment to each other and actually fulfill it and test it out with each other.
I want to raise the standard by increasing the skepticism on Obama. Raise the standard of honesty by never giving him the benefit of the doubt.
I don't think we want to give him the benefit of the doubt ever anymore. He's the most disappointing person in politics in the history of my life, and I go way back. I mean, I've been in the civil rights movement since 1959.
You just summarized the culture Culture of Narcissism by Christopher Lasch very well. And it's a fine book and filled with insights. Okay, great. And we can be as cynical as we like, and you never risk anything by taking a dim view of a politician.
Oh,
it's
I
a
do.
very safe position. But you risk nothing because no one can disprove it. And
I risk having my butt thrown in jail every 2 or 4 weeks.
That's not going to happen because of what you just said here. I think sometimes it can be more gutsy to say, for some reason or another, I suspect this time this guy's being sincere. Why not?
Okay.
If that's my gut,
where
that's my gut.
Where we were, gentlemen, thank you so much. This is you're making my job easy here, fellas. Thank you, thank you. And the media is, Deadline is about the media coverage of current events and politics. And part of that media, Dr. Blanton, if you'll hold your book up, it'd be helpful to us. Is what's the name of the book?
My book. This is my autobiography. The first half of it called "Some New Kind of Trailer Trash," which is about me. I'm some new kind of trailer trash. And basically, it's about transformation. How do you get beyond living out the role you were given?
But I wanted to bring in the book and connect the truth in the media.
Yeah.
And how the media is covering Trayvon Martin. And when I listen to Mr. Dixon and I listen to the critical remarks about the president, what I'm thinking is, somehow, and he mentioned much earlier in the conversation that one party will use these events to turn out the vote. Mm-hmm. And the media fuels that to get their ratings for something sensational. But we just had a local election a couple days ago in Virginia, and we saw a very low turnout. Mm-hmm. My point is, isn't that part of the job of politicians, part of the job of the media, to inform and get people off the couch to participate? Because the very changes that Mr. Dixon talked about, you talk about in your book, the changes, what would there have ever been a special prosecutor called in the Trayvon Martin case, were it not for the media, Adam?
Well, that's a good point. I think there would have. I think there was a significant, legitimate grassroots outcry, as has been pointed out. I think it was inflamed, but I think that because there was a larger or a set of larger issues tapped by it, that it would have come out anyways. It would have gotten the judicial attention that it deserved. But turnout, even in the Republican presidential primary right now, is at record lows. I mean, we just saw in the Illinois primary, it was 15%. For the Republican primary.
As Dr. Blanton pointed out, but my goodness, with a field like that, what do you expect?
Fair enough. All right. Well,
now, if they had Roseanne Barr in that field.
Right.
Well, I've endorsed Ron Paul, but the turnout for him was very low there as well. And I think this is actually, I kind of take encouragement from this in a way, because it means that people...
The coverage of Trayvon Martin.
No. From the lower engagement in politics and the lower turnout, in a way, I think people are realizing the futility of turning to the government to solve problems that should be handled locally, that should be handled, as peaceful communities rather than through the force of government. I think that's an encouraging trend, because
I think it's an encouraging trend too, and I think it's also an encouraging trend that less people are watching TV. You get that thing and you start muting it when the commercials come on, and then the main thing comes on, you mute it then, and after a while you're just muting it all the time.
I actually canceled my
you don't believe all the BS that's being generated. The media doesn't have the power to turn people out for an election, because the people know that most of what they're talking about is just crap.
But
they're not actually. The media doesn't cover anything in depth.
And the media is part of the barrier to independent or third party or candidates that challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
I mean, you see the same thing on the biggest scale now with Ron Paul as an example. But people realize that
Jill Stein's a much better example. I mean,
sure, they're all good examples.
If you go to the internet, if you get your news from a better filter, so to speak, where you're able to, it's a pull model instead of the push model.
Exactly.
You're able to find out the information that's relevant.
We're going to lose Mr. Dixon in Atlanta shortly. You still with us, Mr. Dixon? Okay, we have lost him already. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What I was going to say is you've described the upside of the new technologies very well, and it's powerful and real. There's a downside too, though, because it can become an echo chamber where people even more and more hear a very narrow perspective, and they become more and more. So I've seen that in single issue stuff like Middle East related stuff. The other thing is, you asked a very important question: isn't it the job of politicians to get people off the couch to come and vote? Sometimes it is. Say Obama used some of these social media techniques to tap into a certain set of voters that hadn't voted before. We'll see how many of them come out for him again. A lot of them are as disappointed in him as you are. But
Republicans want to keep him on the couch.
Right. That's what I was about to say.
Yeah, okay.
I think generally speaking, you see Republicans trying to keep the voter turnout low. Because it has generally helped their candidates. So it depends on which politicians, when and where, want to bring out the vote. Now, it's not always true of all Republicans by any means, but generally speaking, that's what I was going to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, what's the job of politicians in these circumstances?
Well, to
their
win.
Job,
the job's to win.
Well, to win. And second, in the larger sense, in the bigger picture, their job is to create an illusion of consensus that gives the government license to do what it wants to do.
That's why campaign finance reform.
Sure, legitimation.
Yeah,
to find legitimation for what they do. Yes.
Right, so that's why when there's not a real alternative, when there's not an independent candidate that people can come out for, when you have still 90-something% of races in America a DNR, it's actually really exciting to see that people are saying, yeah, it's not even worth my time. And making a rational, non-voting decision. I believe in voting. I believe in participating in the political process. But when you see that the difference is so narrow and the system has become so corrupt, hey, if you got something better to do that day, I'm not going to blame you.
Let me just say, you could look at it as positive, and I think it would be better to have more diversity in politics, or you could look at it as negative. It might be constructive cynicism, or it might be apathy. If it's real apathy that doesn't produce any alternative, then it's not so great.
There's definitely a lot of apathy in
there. Fine. Well, the apathy is not healthy, and the constructive cynicism is.
Well, it depends. No, it depends. The apathy deep enough becomes healthy. Once it gets bad enough, it gets good.
Does apathy turn to desperation at this point?
Apathy turns into, I'm not putting up with this anymore. It
turns to some kind of motivation or awareness.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty optimistic.
I have a book out just last year called The Corporate Cannibal Cookbook, where Chris Hedges and a lot of other people have stolen a lot of their stuff and put it in there. But one of the theses is that in a lot of things in biological kingdoms, like a lot of ant colonies and a lot of bees, they kill the queen and eat her every couple of years. So I suggest cannibalism is the answer. That we just start eating from the top instead of the bottom. That we take 1,092 billionaires, kill them and eat them and have a ritual.
How about we just stop eating people altogether? How about we just condemn this idea of government, of living off other people to begin with? Why can't we just find the cooperative, peaceful ways to
I just created room for you to be to the right of me.
The Shakespearean phrase for it is those who make their generation messes.
Yes.
Let's bring the conversation down to the Arab awakening or the Arab uprising, and of course the
pluralize it. Arab uprisings.
Zines.
Yeah, because they're not homogenous.
The Arab Summit that's going on right now, how significant is it?
In Baghdad, it's significant in two ways. In one positive way and in one negative way. It's the positive way is that it really does signal the return of Iraq to the Arab fold. The Emir of Kuwait went to Iraq. He kissed Prime Minister Maliki on the cheek. This is Iraqi-Kuwaiti rapprochement, and it's healthy for the Arab world because really Iraq, for Iraqi stabilization and for regional stability, it's important to have Iraq back in the Arab fold. As messed up as the Arab fold might be, if you've got important Arab states that are just absolutely not plugged into it and alienated from it, that's not healthy. The downside is that I think what it showed is that the Arab states are really severely divided on the most pressing question facing them, which is Syria. And they were much more divided a few months ago. And they were more, I think the sectarianism that drove the unity, which was in a way unhealthy, has broken down a bit in terms of national interest, and you're seeing a real divide there. So they're less able to act in a serious way on this pressing issue of Syria. So the Arab League is coming together more by bringing Iraq back into the fold, but it's proving itself to be, as it has traditionally been, an impotent group of impotent states.
Some leaders in the United States, Green leaders, have been over there demonstrating. Prior to the show, you and I were discussing it. Are you optimistic about the move with the Arab?
It's impossible to tell because this is a tornado, and it's impossible to know what the nature and effect of a tornado is while it's still swirling around, changing the landscape wherever it touches down. I'm optimistic about some countries and very worried about others. The region in general, it's absolutely up in the air. I'm optimistic about Tunisia and Libya. For various reasons. I'm extremely worried about Egypt. I'm terrified by what's happening in Syria, where I see an almost inexorable drift towards sectarian civil war that would quite possibly look more like the Balkans, like Yugoslavia, than Lebanon or Iraq. It could be really, really ugly there. I'm worried about Yemen. On the other hand, regionally, I think it's very important that people won't take it anymore, that people are just not going to allow presidents for life, that they're demanding dignity, that they're standing up for themselves, etc. The downside of that is newly opened political spaces accrue immediately to the benefit of the religious right because they're organized, because they have a brand name, because liberal or centrist groups or any other kind of ideology has been suppressed or not organized or not articulated.
Well, let me ask you a question.
But that's a temporary thing. It's a temporary thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bahrain, get Bahrain in there.
That Bahrain is the most complex of all because in Bahrain you've got a Sunni minority ruling family ruling over a disenfranchised and marginalized Shiite majority, and the big thing about Bahrain is neither side can win. Right? The government and the Sunni royal family cannot suppress the majority indefinitely. However, Bahrain is going to stay part of what is ultimately a Sunni Arab Gulf region. It's too tied into it economically, culturally, familially, etc. So it can't break away. It can't be on its own. It can't be aligned with Iran or anything. That's not going to happen. So there's got to be a deal. There's no other way for that country to get out of the mess it is in. But both the government and the opposition seem to keep falling back on the modus operandi, which is confrontation. And so it's going to get a hell of a lot worse before it gets any better. And it is also very troubling. One of the worst things about it is it is a manifestation of and could be a touchstone for broader Sunni Shiite rivalries and sectarianism within the Arab world. And that is certainly the last thing we need. But it's really one of the things that's been emerging at a regional level most strikingly for the past 14 months. And it's a dangerous turn of events.
And the media really isn't covering that. Dr. Blanton?
Not really.
Well, the question I have is,
US,
isn't this expectable? If that's what's going on to me, that seems to me a little bit hopeful, is the sectarian element, the breakdown of religiosity and fundamentalism. It doesn't make, if you're a fundamentalist, it doesn't make a difference if you're Rick Santorum or if you're an Arab Sunni or the problem is fundamentalism. It's true believership.
Right.
And true believership seems to me to be falling apart, regardless of the best efforts of the Sunnis and the Shiites and all the different groups and cliques there are in the Arab world.
Honestly,
their younger people don't buy the BS of the older people.
You know, it's a mixed bag. When you look at the revolutionaries who took to the streets, I mean, for sure, if 2 years ago you said to me, millions of people would come out in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and overthrow their governments. Yeah. What would the ideology have been? With a heavy heart, I would have told you probably religious fundamentalism.
Right.
And it wasn't anything of the kind.
Right.
It was social consciousness,
exactly.
Patriotism, ecumenical, Muslims and Christians, atheists, communists, everybody together. Now, on the other hand, now that political spaces open up when you have elections, the Islamists are the ones who are doing better than anybody else because they're more organized. So there's a catch-up time. But I agree with you. I'm optimistic on that. I think we're going to go through a phase in the Arab world where we have exaggerated influence from the religious right, but it'll be contained by other social forces, and I think it'll ultimately not give way to fundamentalist governments. People say the Arab Spring has turned into the Islamist winter, and I say where? Where are Islamists in power? Name me a single Arab country. They aren't.
Where they've got
real
power.
control.
Right.
Real control. Like, for instance, between the Muslim Brothers and the Salafists, they won a huge percentage of seats in the Egyptian parliament. April Fool, that parliament doesn't have any power. Egypt has a presidential system that right now is in the hands of the military, and in a couple of months they're going to have an election where there are a large number of people who might win Many of them, most of them, are not Islamists. So you'll have this mixed system, and they're negotiating power. And I think the Islamists are peaking right now. I think they're hitting their stride. This is the best they're ever going to do. And as of 1 or 2 years from now, especially if democracies go forward and constitutionalism goes forward, you'll see liberal parties, centrist parties, libertarian parties, communist parties, other monarchist parties, others, really start to organize and get their share of power. But there will be a religious right. You can't do away with it. Freud's right. We're never going to be rid of this thing.
Well, if it declines significantly, I'll be happy. It's like
I don't know if Freud's right, but it's exciting to see that if you think back and compare this to the American founding, when at the time a new nation, new territory. If you conveniently ignored the thing about the Native Americans, but the idea that establishing a new nation in new territory with a completely fresh system of government, having severed independence, that the founders of this country were able to draw on the wisdom of so many that had gone before. They weren't stuck in, well, it's been this way here in America for so many years, so it's just going to have to be this way for a while. There was none of that, and they were able to take a fresh start and came up with a system that gave us the most economic freedom and the most personal freedom at the time on Earth, although obviously it didn't last too long. And now we're seeing the complete reversal here in the United States of that. But what's ironic is that it's the consequences of the great government that grew out of that great free economy that caused the oppression in the Middle East and the manipulation of their governments that led to this in the first place.
Yes.
And what's so exciting to see now, by comparison, is that we don't have any sort of new territory. No one's going to move to Antarctica and start their new big government there and have a new nation with millions of people.
Unless
but
we
in the
have
Middle
to,
East,
because that'll be the only place we can grow anything.
This is the first major chance that humanity has had to say we're going to press the reset button, and we're doing it where, compared to the founders of this country, who had books and had a 3-month trip to get across the ocean, in order to share that knowledge. Now it's happening in the presence of the internet, and they're able to tap that entire global wealth of information in creating a new paradigm.
Let me briefly
organization.
connect this to your concerns, which have to do with individual liberties. You've been very consistent on that throughout this show. So
it's not
what
just
we have.
this show.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying. I never met you before, and I can tell that's your focus. Okay,
well,
great.
It's a moral
point. I understand that. And this is what I'm getting at here. There are 3 pitfalls facing post-dictatorship Arab societies. One is military rule, another which can happen. Another is you get rid of a president, you end up with a junta. Okay, right? You kind of have that in Egypt, but they're trying to transition out of it. Another one is failed states, like Yemen might turn into a failed state, or Syria could even maybe. But the third, and this is the one that's really the most worrying, is tyrannous majorities. Because most Arabs, except for ruling elites like the presidents and their courtiers, or the monarchs and their courtiers, or the extreme ultra Islamists like Al-Qaeda, believe that governance requires the consent of the governed, and that the only way to get that is through regular elections. That means that 97+% of Arabs have accepted this. What I think is less understood is that once a majority acquires the right to form a government through periodic elections, that there are individual rights accruing to individual citizens, to women, to minorities, to people on the basis of their status as a human being. I think that's less well understood, and that's something that really has to be worked on by everyone who's involved, so that we don't end up with if we can avoid juntas and failed states and wars, we don't end up with tyrannous majorities.
I almost feel like I needed a preface to go back and preface my remarks to say I was much more excited about the Arab Spring when it started than I'm looking at it now. At least for the midterm, the short term and the midterm possibilities.
That's everybody.
I'm not as optimistic as I first was, but I'm still very optimistic for what the Middle East is going to look like in 20 years, and what it's going to look like in 20 years. What that's going to say about what it's going to look like 50 years from now.
I think that's very well said. And by the way, everyone is less happy now than they were in, say, February.
Answer me this.
Answer
me this, gentlemen. And this is why people watch Deadline, to hear the kind of insight and the unique insight and valuable perspectives that you all bring. Why don't we hear more of this at large, that information you've given us today in American media?
I guess I think that if you read some of the major newspapers carefully and read them thoroughly, you will hear a lot of it. The work of the late Anthony Shadid brought a lot of this out. He was a good reporter for the New York Times. Borzu Dagari covers this very well for the LA Times. If you read the major papers carefully, you'll get a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it. And certainly if you go into the foreign policy journals like Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, etc., this stuff is discussed, and it's discussed in a fairly serious way, and there are lots of different points of view. The problem is people don't get their information from those sources. They get them from TV, mostly local news, and local news gets these little packages from the big networks, and then they have these stupid cable TV argument shows of Food Fight where they have a 2-minute segment that's usually a Republican against a Democrat spinning with an eye to the next election. And so for sure, if you relied on mainstream media, particularly television, for your information, you will be completely confused and misinformed. Your best bet is to get on Twitter and follow a bunch of well-informed, serious, interesting people on Twitter, and that is absolutely the best source of information.
Twitter's very brief, and of course, I'm sure you also meant to say never to miss deadline.
Well, of course. I mean, obviously,
on the issue of the media,
obviously,
here,
never. Yeah.
It does point to the importance of media outlets like ATN that challenge the American mainstream. But you have to think for a second, like, what is the job of the American mainstream media? What is their actual purpose? And if anything, as part of the establishment, their job is to maintain the status quo, to maintain the current paradigm, to serve the current powered interest. And so they want to maintain the government's agenda. They want to generally not threaten the government's power over the people. So let's see. On the other side of the world, millions and millions of people are rising up and overthrowing and changing their governments entirely. No, I don't think we want to set a bad example for the American people. I mean, it really, in a sense, is that simple. And you've seen, on the left, there have been a number of attempts, like with Occupy DC. One of the Occupy DCs here in DC started by a group. I'm not proud of this particular action of theirs, but I am a member of Veterans for Peace, and we're trying to do an American Spring, and this version of it. And the people here, I mean, it was obvious that there was no popular support for it, that we weren't anywhere close to that tipping point because we still largely turn to the mainstream media. But this is the thing that the internet is shifting, and eventually, the American people, when we're going, man, why does our economy suck so bad? Why do we have such a totalitarian government? We're going to look back 10 years ago. What was that thing that happened in Egypt that we didn't hear that much about? How did they do that again?
Just to talk about the media in the Arab Spring for a second, the media in the Arab world just for a second. There are some commentators who attribute what's happened mainly to cable TV networks like Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya and others, and or mobile phones, Twitter and Facebook. And that's a major factor. The creation of a new Arab public sphere is a factor.
IRNN?
But or Mini.
Or Press
all
TV.
Kinds of, there are all kinds. But I was speaking mainly of Arabic language ones.
Right.
Because those are the ones that really capture most audiences. But the point is, that's a factor, but there are a lot of other factors. There's a socioeconomic factor that's huge. The middle class poor, the fact that you have millions and millions of people with professional education and no jobs. The fact that there was this arbitrary government. I mean, you want to talk about abusive policing. You couldn't do better than the stuff that was meted out to people in Cairo and in Tunis. There are dozens of other factors involved here, so it's overdetermined. But the media has been one of the factors pushing forward these rebellions.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes more. I want to get into a couple of other things quickly. We want to talk about the BRIC conference. That's India, South Africa, China, Russia, Brazil gathering. The big picture that jumped out at me is this gentleman who set himself ablaze, Tibet, at the start of the conference in New Delhi, in protest of the domination by China. There's the image right there. And it reminded me of an old friend of mine, Petra Kelly, of course, who helped found the Green Party. She spent her whole life working on the Free Tibet movement. That colors for some what's going on with BRIC, but they're talking about creating a new currency to get away from the dollar. Your thoughts, gentlemen?
Well,
can it succeed?
There's a confrontation coming at some point, at least in the American economic system and the debate for the economy in the United States when it comes to the United States dollar and the actions of the Federal Reserve and all of the inflation we've been experiencing that we're not feeling. But the inflation, of course, refers to the inflation of the monetary supply, not the increase in prices that is usually the result. And we've had this inflation, and we see that the economic consequences are coming, and they're compounding, and they're getting worse and worse. And we keep kicking the can down the road of addressing this, that we have a fiat currency system. And what's happening, whether you like it or not, thanks to Ron Paul, thanks to a lot of people on the internet who are able to do the research and now wrap their heads around complex economic topics through self-education like never before has been possible, they're able to see that this whole idea of a government-controlled currency isn't necessary. And that's and I hope that they're not going to win and be able to impose another fiat currency, but that when people see these conversations, they'll be plugged in and demand better.
Let's give them both 30 seconds. We're almost out of time.
Yes,
I want regional people-controlled currencies are things that are of value that don't become bubbles. Like, I think you should buy whiskey instead of gold, for example. Gold and silver are just another bubble because they're evaluated with a fiat currency.
They're so undervalued.
And like as soon as most of the oil purchased is not purchased with dollars, we're in terrible trouble. Yeah, and we're going to be in bioregional communities of people that take care of each other and invent a new kind of economy that has to do with personal relationships between people.
The BRICS undoubtedly will succeed, and this is all part of the development of a multipolar world. The bipolar world died, was replaced with a unipolar world that is dying before our eyes. The United States is still the preeminent military power in the world because we spend more than everybody else, but financially
more than everybody else in the world
combined, correct?
So.
Right, and we have R&D and education, which is combined with all of that, which are our main competitive advantages. But in terms of finances and many other indicators, power is shifting both globally into a multipolar world with Europe and China and Russia, and also the BRICS. The fact that these southern
will succeed.
It will absolutely succeed, and even though they are divided on Syria, which is interesting.
That's true. We're almost out of time. Dr. Blanton, in your book here, the New York Post reporter Mandy Statmiller says, Dr. Brad Blanton's book changed my life. He changed my life. Everyone will benefit from reading his story. A few seconds about your book, Brad.
It's about transformation, about when you stop identifying yourself as your achievements and your reputation, and you identify yourself as a person sitting here right now looking at each other talking, and your present tense noticing being is your primary identity. You no longer have to lie to maintain your identity.
All right,
we've got to close it. Everything.
We've got to close it down. We're out of time. I thank you all. That's it for this edition of Deadline. Thanks to our team behind the camera. Thanks to the executive producer, Afra Haj, for putting together a great show. And thanks to our guests, Independent Green Party leader, Dr. Brad Blanton, producer, Marine Corps vet, Adam Kokish, and Hussein Ibish of the American Task Force on Palestine, and Bruce Dixon, who joined us at the start of the show. I'm wearing a blue tie today. Kentucky is in the final round of the National Collegiate Basketball Association Championships. My alma mater, go Kentucky. I'm Kerry Campbell. Join us again next time on Deadline.